Hey, and welcome back. We're going to talk about the grid today. Now, what is a grid? Lots of people are scared of it for some reason. I get it. Grids kind of look really restrictive and they look scary. I mean, just look at this thing. Wow. Even though they look like prison bars, they aren't as restrictive as you may think. The grid is a structure comprising of a series of lines that divide the page into columns. We have vertical and horizontal. And this structure helps designers arrange content on a page, like you can see here. Everything is sitting on a grid. This is something we never include in our final designs. You'll never see somebody print a poster like this and have a grid showing, or you'll never see a website with a grid showing unless somebody purposefully did that, but usually that's incredibly rare. Maybe as a stylistic approach, but I don't really recommend it. Now, it serves as a skeleton for your layout, and originally the grid came from print design, but if we ever think about where there are grids, I mean, they're basically applied in a lot of places. Let's take a look. We got bookcases. We even have subdivisions. I mean, they are everywhere. I want to show you more about grids, but I want to teach you a little bit about history because I think understanding the past will really help you understand the basics. Now, grids have always been linked to typography. Over here, they were first used to arrange handwriting on paper, and then later on were transformed into the manuscript layout. You can see this over here. And we're going to get into what the manuscript layout looks like and what it comprises of. Since the early days, grids were used to help aid readers in reading. Now let's fast forward all the way to the Renaissance. Now this era had a profound impact on grid systems. I mean, many artists strived for perfect geometry. Many paintings resulted in the centered symmetrical layouts, like this. We have very centered layout. You can see all the symmetry and hidden geometry within this painting. You wouldn't necessarily notice it if these guidelines weren't here to show you, but this is what a lot of Renaissance paintings really strived for. You ever heard of the golden ratio? In the 13th century, Villard de Honcourt created the diagram to achieve harmonious design. This diagram was a merger between the grid system and the golden ratio. And it was created to produce page layouts based off of margins with fixed ratios. And this technique is still used in today. You can see that, this is a fairly recent layout and it is in fact using it. Jumping forward to the Industrial Revolution, beginning of mass production and the rise of newspapers, posters, etc. With so much content on one page, like look at this, it's hard to read as is, even with a nice little grid layout. But with so much content on one page, designers needed to develop a way to communicate their message while allowing for natural reading behavior. They've achieved that here. There are newspapers that were much worse than this. Now, last stop. The grid we know and use today is very much tied to Swiss design. It doesn't look like much, but many systems were born from this. I want you to picture this. World War I, and Switzerland was neutral, of course. It all kind of became a common meeting ground for creatives. And because publications had to set 3 separate languages, which were German, Italian, and French, because there were there was such an influx of people, designers needed to come up with a solution. Typographers like Jan Tischhold and Herbert Bayer, they stepped up to address that. And for the first time, white space was used as an element in layout design. And you can see that in a lot of layouts today, a lot of white space, and they all kind of came from that. Even if you look at the print design that we saw earlier, showing that first grid, that kind of system was born from this. And, Swiss design has a profound impact on layout. Now we're going to jump into some more basics. So before we can even jump into actually building a grid, let's talk about some of the basics that impact all the different decisions surrounding sizing, measuring, and spacing. The first thing, base units. What is a base unit? This is our starting point. This is ground zero. Let's define a base unit. Now, this is what defines what every single measurement will be a multiple of. Why? This makes our designs consistent, improves how we hand off to developers, and reduces the amount of decisions we need to make as a designer. So what should you set your base unit to? I use an 8-pixel base unit because it makes scaling for a variety of devices really easy. Most screen sizes are divisible by 8. It's also divisible by itself. 8 divided by 2 equals 4, 8 divided by 4 equals 2. There are even 4 pixels, 5 pixels, 6 pixels, and even 10 pixel increments. There is no wrong answer here. Like I said, I like using 8 pixels and spacing icons, by a 4-pixel half step. Right here, we have an 8-pixel base unit. And you can see it's spaced out to 16, 24, 32, and so on and so forth. Up next is sizing. Now, all UI elements should be measured in increments of our base unit. This helps us with a bunch of things like clear alignment, consistency, and hierarchy. Let's take a look at the difference between the two here. One's using an 8-pixel base unit, the other one isn't really using anything, and there's just no rhythm. It may seem minuscule, but if I were checking out a product or a website, and I came across a credit card input like this, paired with all these different UI elements, I would think twice about entering my information. Padding. This is the space between all of our elements, and you guessed it, it is measured based off of our base unit. This makes spacing consistent and readable to our users. Think about this card over here. All elements are spaced using increments from an 8-pixel base unit. It creates uniformity. We have 16 pixels on this side, 16 pixels over here. We got 16 pixels here. You see on this grid on the bottom, these rows, which we'll get into soon, we got 4 pixels, 4 pixels, 4 pixels. Next is layout. So what do all these lines and boxes mean? What are they? These are some questions you may be asking. Let's talk about the anatomy of a grid. All grids are made up of 3 key things: columns, gutters, and margins. The first one is columns. Let's cover that. Our vertical blocks right here that span left to right. So right here on this page, we got a little 4-column grid. And generally the column width won't change, but the number of columns change from 12 on desktop, maybe 8 to tablet. Some people like 4 on mobile. I mean, you can use anything you want. I like to use 6 on mobile because it gives me flexibility to place 3 elements in a row on the screen. I even like to use 8 on mobile. Like I said, if you want to hang things off the screen, we'll see that later on, but nothing is set in stone. Gutters. This is the white space right here, right between columns. They're dedicated based off of your base unit, so some designs will increase that size as you scale up or decrease it as you scale down. Other grids can stay fixed. It's not really set in stone. So right over here, this is probably like a 16-pixel gutter based off of a 8-pixel base unit. Margins are the white space between the edge of your column and the edge of your frame. You can combine all these elements to build different types of grids. The manuscript grid, we saw this before, kind of looks like a grid for a manuscript, right? Well, they can be useful for defining margins and for large blocks of text. This is the most popular one, the column grid. Kind of looks like the grids you see today, kind of what we've shown off. Now, these are the types of grids we mostly use, and these columns are spaced evenly, and that is where we start to align our content. Most grids utilize 12 columns, and you may be asking, well, why 12? Well, 12 columns can be divided into halves, thirds, fourths, and sixths. This helps for designing for responsive screens. The modular grid. This is a variation of the column grid we saw before. You'll notice that they have both vertical and horizontal rows. So we got vertical columns going left to right, horizontal rows going top to bottom, and this creates these modules that provide some additional layout options for single or larger box. The baseline grid. Now this one's important. I use this one all the time as well. I like to couple this with my column grid. They consist of these horizontal rows that you see here from top to bottom, and these provide guidance for typography and UI elements. They create vertical rhythm. And think of when you were in school and you used to write on a piece of paper. Yeah, it's similar to that. And yes, it's based off of your base unit. I like to use a 4-pixel baseline grid. Now, placing typography on a baseline grid, you use line height. And this is that bounding box right around your type. So say your font size is something like 16 pixels. Your line height could be something like 24 pixels. We have maybe like a 40 pixel typeset over here for the headline, and our font size for the headline. And for the line height, we have something like 48 pixels. So multiply by 8, and on that baseline grid, so we got 4 pixel here, 4 pixel here. So we got 8 pixel spacing between the top and the bottom here, and we got 12 between the subheader and the copy. So this creates this vertical rhythm that really helps to create consistency throughout your whole piece. Let's jump into responsive grids in Figma. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are going to be talking about grids and spacing. More so, we are going to be getting into the different types of grids, and we're going to be learning about things like fluid grids, fixed grids. We're going to learn about breakpoints. Let's jump in and take a look. We're going to learn about the difference between these two. Let me just pop open my grids right here. So now I'm making my grids visible. We're going to learn about the different types of breakpoints that we can have. I'm going to jump through a bunch of different rules that's going to set you on the right path to ensure that you make some really great design decisions. And then we are going to build our own grid. I'm going to teach you how to do that. You're going to learn about how to create grid styles. So let's jump right in. Hey everyone, welcome back. We are going to be talking about fixed and fluid grids. These are different types of grids that we're going to make in Figma. I'm usually the person that loves to make fluid grids, but definitely fixed grids have their place. So let's jump right in. So as you can see, I'm going to zoom in. You see these little red faint lines over here? If we go in and click our frame, so I've clicked the fixed grid frame, this is where our grid is. This is all the different properties associated with that grid. I'm not going to get into it, but that's why we are going to have these red lines or these columns. Now, how do you see those columns? Because you may not be seeing them in your resource right now. So my shortcut is a Shift and a G. But if you go over here into the zoom and view options, you can see over here is where you're going to find your layout grid view options, and you're going to see the shortcut associated with that. So if you want to easily just toggle them off, which I usually do, go ahead and do that. Let's jump in to the fixed grid. So what is a fixed grid? Basically, the fixed grid has a fixed container width and position. So if we take this grid, this frame, and we start, expanding it a bit, we notice that the actual main container that contains the grid, it doesn't budge at all. So we have all these little grid containers. They're staying fixed based off of the columns here. It actually maintains its exact measurements while the margin, which are these spaces on either side, increases or decreases. So if I go in the opposite direction, it is not going to be responsive. So let's just go back and get it to shrink again. There we go, we're back to normal. So this is really great if you want all your elements to stay proportional, but when you get to larger screens, you may end up with way too much white space on either side, like this. So you may need to think of a different way for your design treatment to not have so much just white space. Let's talk about fluid grids right here on the side. So this is what I usually use. I usually give it a little bit more of a margin on the side here, but let's jump right in. Fluid grids are measured in percentages. So the columns of the grid or your entire grid will shrink or grow depending on the size of your screen. Let me show you what I mean. So as I shrink and grow or expand, and as the frame collapses, the content is going to do the same. Now, if we look at the content right here, we can see you can do this pretty easily by setting the content's constraints. Since this is just a regular frame, I can, make it so that it's, just this amount of columns or the full amount of columns, and then, set it to left and right. Or you can put things in an auto layout frame. These are just little rectangles that I have spaced out here. But if we look into the makeup of this actual grid, we can see that it stretches. So that means it's going to stretch based off of the content. And this one, if we look into there, we will see that it is centered, meaning that it's going to be fixed. Now, one thing that you'll see that is pretty cool here is that if you look at your margins and your gutters, so these are your gutters and these are your margins, if you look at them while I move this grid around, they stay exactly the same. So they are not going to shift. Just the column widths, these little red columns, they're going to shift in size. Now, one con of this approach is that when you are on larger screens and want to utilize all the extra space, sometimes your content may look stretched out. So what I like to do is I like to create several sizes. one for a very large screen that is more, fixed or has a really large margin on either side. So that way we don't get situations like this, because then, content's just not going to look good on a website. So sometimes I'll take this approach for very large screens. And that is the difference between a fixed and a fluid grid. Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be talking about breakpoints. Now, breakpoints are just different variations of your grid based off of sizes of the screen. So I have a bunch of different sizes here. As you can see, I have small, which is kind of like a tablet, and we have medium, we have large, and then extra large, maybe some 1400 pixel width screens. So I'm going to get into the reasoning as to why we create these types of breakpoints. Now, we need to always keep breakpoints in mind when designing for responsive layouts. That means, web-based layouts that are going to be able to be used on like mobile screens all the way to very large websites or very large resolutions. So as you notice, based off of our little demonstration around fixed and fluid grids, content will stretch and shrink depending on the screen size. And that is fine. We can't run away from this, but don't worry, we can work around this. So breakpoints allow us to scale up and down our design from mobile to desktops. So we have this is kind of like tablet. So we can have like a mobile screen as well. Now, the first step is to definitely establish a set of breakpoints, and I wouldn't worry too much. There's a bunch of literature out there about certain breakpoints, and what works best here is like just a set of breakpoints to get us started. These are based off of David Gilbertson's article. Now, this is the small, medium, large, extra large. At small, I have, just for this one, I have around, the max width is 599 pixels. I will usually have a smaller version as well if I really want to get into it. But this one even can, work for things like the iPhone 13, which I think is like a 390. So, this could work for that screen as well. It's really up to preference. At medium, I have anything between 600 pixels and 899 pixels. At large, I have anything from 900 pixels to pretty much 1200 pixels. And then at extra large, I have, so this one's at 1400 pixels in width. And these are basic types of layout grids I have for that. So as you notice, extra large and large both will have pretty much 12 column grids, but here is where we start to break it down a bit. Like maybe we don't need that many on like tablet, and we can, afford to go down in the amount of columns because there isn't much content that needs to be placed along there, or the layout just doesn't get as complex. Now, these breakpoints are going to help you define these small, medium, and large breakpoints, and you can definitely modify your layout grid to change dramatically based off of the breakpoint, or you can change it slightly. So let's take a look at what we got here. Now, these 4 frames, and you'll notice that each frame has a slightly different layout depending on the size of the screen as well. So, content may shift, blocks may pop down. Over here we have 3 column layout for these items, and that's what you need to think about when it comes to responsiveness, because we want to ensure that this content is going to either stack on top of one another, or some content's going to get removed, because it will happen, especially when you get down to the smaller screens and you start losing some of that horizontal space. Now, these are all fluid layouts. So if I start to stretch that frame, the content's going to stretch with it. And even the mobile version, we'll notice that even when we get to that medium break point over here, this is kind of like our mobile version. We're going to notice that that frame and content will start adhering to this design. So like if I start scaling up, then I'm going to ensure that, okay, this row of content, performs in a certain way where maybe it stacks, or now we have enough space to have like 2 large blocks or something like that. So just keep that in mind. Now, I know I mentioned things like, okay, when we get to larger screens, we need to start thinking about like bigger margins, and you can come in here and do that pretty easily just by saying you want a center margin, and then you can specify the actual width. And, you can say that each column is, I don't know, let's find a number that works. It could be like 80 pixels. and all this content can shrink down. And then now we have like, that grid that's going to work really nicely here. And then these are just going to be at center for the constraints, so they stick with that grid. So definitely a lot of options here. This is what I would do once I start getting to extra large, because I don't like things totally like touching the edge of the screen. So definitely, I would employ that tactic. But that's how you start making breakpoints, because you will need to design for different screens based off of the type of product you're building. If it's a website, you definitely need to do something like this. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Let's jump in, and we are going to be talking about styles. So I think everyone has heard about color styles, typography styles, there's image styles, effect styles, and there's also layout styles. If we go over here and click on our canvas, we notice we don't have any styles right now. And you may be thinking, like, why do I need to make grid styles? Well, I mean, it's really important. And for the sake of your own sanity, you should save your grids as styles, especially when you're working in like a new file and you really just want to, attach it to every frame you need to use. That way we aren't constantly repeating ourselves when we create a new frame and reinventing that wheel or copying and pasting them. So if I take like a new frame here and I just, I'm going to just call this one grid right now. If I take this new frame and I want this grid on this frame because it's a pretty cool frame and it matches in terms of the breakpoint. So I can copy this grid, like the properties here, and with Command C or Control C, and go to my grid and paste it. So just Command or Control V. And there you go, that grid's there. But to do that every single time, to try to find sometimes the grid layer that you want, it's a pain. Now, the way we can get around this is that we're going to turn this grid into a style. Let's jump right in. This keeps everything in one nice, neat place. So when you need to apply it to a frame, you just basically select that style easily. So the way to create a grid style is you jump right into here and you press this little style icon. And here you can just, once you've pressed that, it's going to pop this dialog box and you can just name it whatever you want. You can say desktop, and this is the naming convention for like foldering. So you use that slash and you can say desktop / L for large. And there we go. And, I can say this one as well. I could say, oops, that's for searching. I'm going to press that plus button, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say desktop / XL. So if I do want to, apply that, I can. Now you can even just go here, click on that frame, go to your layout grid and click that style button, and you can apply whatever style you want. And just like that, we have created a grid style. Now you can't stack styles upon one another. Like you can't put two styles on one frame, but you can put different layout grids on a frame. And I'm going to get to that, but this is how you just apply style. So if I take this and I'm just going to like duplicate it over here and I stretch it out and now I have a very large screen. I need to swap it for the XL version. I can do that. And if I want, say, I want a larger margin on this, I can go into my edit style and it's going to open up this box. And here you can go into the properties. You can give it a description. You can rename it. You can say, hey, I want a larger margin on both sides. That means like my column width needs to come down on this one. So I need to specify something like, okay, 60 pixels. So now, as you can tell, it gets changed everywhere within this document. So that's how you're going to use styles to basically create some pretty awesome, reusability within your file that you're using. I definitely, if you don't have the free account of Figma, I mean, you can actually publish these styles by just going up here, publish your styles and components, and you can publish those. You won't be able to publish components if you have any, because if you're on a free account, you can't do that. You can publish styles though, and you can access them across files. So that is how you create a grid style. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are going to now build our own layout grid for our mobile screens right now. So let's jump right in. So this is actually the resource that's going to be available to you, but I'm going to show you how to build this exact same layout grid. It's both a combination of a baseline grid, which has the blue rows running from top to bottom, and then the column grid, which is that responsive column grid that's going to run left to right. And we're going to create two. We'll create one without the baseline, because I know a lot of people either don't like to use baseline grids. Some people are really like big sticklers about using baseline grids and ensuring everything is like on that baseline. You know, in reality, the truth is when it comes to code, that doesn't necessarily sometimes translate as well, but we're going to do it anyways. And I'm going to show you how. So let's jump right in. So that's just our reference over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press F, and then I'm going to grab a screen. Let's just use the 13 Pro, because I think that's what we're going to use as our screen for designing, and we'll make it responsive. So that way, you know, it's going to be able to stretch if we need it for larger or smaller screens, stretch and shrink, that is. So let's jump in. We'll just call this mobile layout grid, and we're going to bring that up here. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to just create the columns. So we are going to jump in and go to auto layout. Nope. We're going to go to our layout grid, and we're going to press that little plus button. So now we have like this random like dot grid. This is really great if you want to design icons and stuff like that. We don't want to do that. So we want to actually create a columns grid. So there we go. You'll notice that on my columns grid here, I actually have 8 columns. I like having a little bit of variety, because that means if I want to use a lot of horizontal scrolling because we don't have as much real estate, it allows me to set different things on these columns pretty easily. So I'm going to go and bump that count all the way to 8. You feel free to, you know, try different things. It really doesn't matter. It's going to be preference. I wouldn't do 12. That's a lot. And I usually cap out at 8 or 6. Some people like to keep it really simple and just do like 2 or 4. I like a little bit of variety, and it really depends on the type of content. So I'm going to keep that color the same. You can change the color if you want. You know, if you want to make it like, say, purple, I mean, we can do that as well. That's what I'm going to do. Purple is one of my favorite colors, so I'm going to roll with purple, and we'll keep it at 10%. We're going to leave the width at auto because we're going to stretch. That means it's going to be able to go like and stretch like that. So it's going to be a responsive grid. Let's go back into those properties. The margin on either side, I like to do things like maybe 16 to 24. If we're thinking about our base unit, like spacing, I like to work with like a 8 pixel or 4 pixel base unit. I'm going to actually just use this 24 pixels because it gives me a lot of breathing room on either side, which I find is something I like. For the gutters though, I like to keep them a little bit tight. So 16 is usually where, you know, I net out when I choose that. And there we go. We've already created the layout grid for just like a 8 column simple grid here. And now we can go ahead and just turn that into a style. So I'm going to just call this one mobile, and we can say that it's 8 column. So I'll just use like COL as a short form for it. And there we go. We have it over here. And the next thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to make a copy of this. So I'm going to, you know, Control C, Command C and V, and make a copy over here. And I'm going to detach this style because I'm going to work on top of it now. So now this is where we're going to build the actual row baseline grid. So we can actually add a grid on top. Now we don't need that one. We're going to go to our rows, and that looks pretty crazy. We don't want that. What we're going to actually do is we're going to keep it to auto because we just want it to, you know, flow nicely. It's going to be a red screen for now, so bear with me. Let's zoom in a bit. We are actually going to just, instead of have it stretch, because we're not like thinking about this massive modular grid or anything like that, we're just going to have it start from the top. So it automatically starts from the top.
And the gutters, I'm going to keep it simple. When we're thinking about like the spacing points that we're using, 4 pixels, 8 pixels, when it comes to the baseline, I like to keep it at 8 pixels because 4 pixels is really tight and there's just too much variation. I like to keep it at 8. I'm just going to keep 8 pixel on the gutter, and then on the height of the actual row, I'm going to keep 8 pixels as well. It's going to start right from the top and go down. And then I'm going to just change the color to something that, stands out a bit. So we can, use red. We can just say like, we can make it a little bit more noticeable like that. We may need to even like, change our colors. This is why people will like use something like a blue and a red, because it's just easier to see what's going on here, because it can get quite distracting. So, I mean, it's preference, whatever is going to work for you, to be honest, at the end of the day. And there we go. And now what we can do, which is really great, is we can actually combine these two into their own style. We can say something like 8 column, and 8 pixel baseline. So that way we know what that is. And if we go over here, click on the canvas, we can see our grid styles. And then we can, start adding a folder if we need to. We can edit them. Right now they're under mobile. If we have desktop styles, we can stack them above in a folder called desktop. So we have our 8 column baseline one right there. And if I'm just press the frame tool and come over here, I can easily jump into my layout grid options and say, hey, I want to apply that one, or no, I want to switch between that one. And these grids that we just created together should carry us throughout the rest of our work here. And that is how you create your own mobile layout grids. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are actually going to be working on a desktop grid as well. So I don't have a reference here. I'm going to go to our breakpoints and just grab this large grid. So I'm going to Command C. I'm just going to copy the entire frame and then go back to this page and paste that here. So I'm just going to get rid of all these, containers that are in there. I like this grid for the most part, but the one thing that's bothering me is that, I still don't like how the margin's so close to here. I'm going to, just modify it a bit, but I'm going to create a new frame and we're going to do it together. So let's do that. So over here, I selected the frame tool. I am not going to use a phone. I'm going to go into desktop. Now here, let me find a desktop that's going to be suitable. I think this is fine for now, and we can shrink that down to say like, 1200. Okay, whatever, 1201. Let's make that 1200, and we'll just call this our desktop grid. Now we can go ahead and create like another version of this if we want. What we could actually do is we could actually apply the style, detach that style, and work based off of what's there. We're just going to create it from scratch. So let's start. So I'm going to add the layout grid onto that frame. We are going to choose the column grids. Now I want 12 on a screen this large, and I would like them to stretch. My gutters, I usually will set them to like 32 pixels or 24 pixels. I think that's totally fine for something like this. But for my margin here, I'm actually going to just bump this up a bit. I think 56 makes everything, I think that's, once again, it's in line with our spacing when it comes to using 4 pixel or 8 pixel intervals. But the other thing is, it looks nicer when the content doesn't just go very close to that edge. It gives it a little bit of breathing space, and it's still responsive if you need it to be. So there you go. We've already created our layout grid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn it into a style. And we can call this our 12 column. There we go. And I'm going to copy and paste this. We're going to add on top of it. So I called that 12 co. So let's just edit that. Perfect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to detach this, and then once again I'm bringing in a new grid on top of this grid. We're going to call this our baseline. So once again, instead of the count, we're going to go with auto. We're going to, let's change the color on this. We'll just use blue. We're going to start from the top because right now it's just stretching. And I'm going to use 8 pixels. So there we go. We've already created the baseline grid. And now, oops, I'm not going to add a new one. Now we can actually add a new grid on top. We can say something like our 12 column and 8 pixel baseline. And there we go. So now we can, we can do a couple things. We can keep on going and make more breakpoints over here. We can add a new folder. So just by right clicking, desktop. So I like to keep things neat. And there we go. We have our folders. You can go even deeper. You can say that, okay, this style right here, or I'm going to add another folder and call this like large styles. And that's basically how we can access them. So if I create another copy of this grid and, remove that altogether, let's see what it looks like when we go to apply them. So this is desktop L. If we were to have desktop medium, there would be another layer here. But, we can just quickly apply that grid over there and it is responsive. So if you need to like give or take a couple of like pixels here and there, you can do that. Now, that is how you create desktop grids in Figma. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are going to be talking about the rules you need to understand if you're going to create beautiful designs that have nice hierarchy, nice layout, and all of that. So let's jump right in. So I think one of the things people forget often is that we know how to create a grid and we need to really know how to actually use it. A lot of people just create the grid and don't use it properly. These are going to be some guidelines. So let's jump in. Elements must sit on some number of columns. So right here, we do have the elements all sitting on those columns. You'll notice that we even have grids within some of our items here, which is another practice that you can, get into if you really want to get down to the nitty gritty of like that type of layout. With auto layout these days, it's not so big of an issue, but when it comes to like the main grid, I would say that, you focus on keeping everything on this really large grid here. Now, your elements must sit on the grid. You can split them up in any which way you want. You notice I'll have like 3 in this like row here, but it must actually sit on that grid. It can't come into over here and rest on top of that column. Now, the other thing I often find is that sometimes people kind of ignore that and they let the content sit in like gutters. It's the same kind of concept. We need to actually have that content over here aligned with that grid. You'll see that kind of rule pop up, that red rule over there. That is where they need to sit. And I would definitely not move it. And if you notice that maybe your content gets a little too close to one another, and say like you have this frame over here, and let's just hide our grids. So we have this frame over here, and if our content didn't, expand within that frame, there's issues where they're very close. Now we have this frame, and we can create like these little cards that give things a little bit more breathing room. We can have a little bit, a little bit more extra breathing room on either side. And that will basically allow you to, even though this text isn't necessarily resting on top of the columns as like I am illustrating, it is definitely resting within the columns of this card. And also like the entire card or the parent card is the one that's on the actual element. So definitely remember that. And, I'm going to build off of this a bit. this is going to just apply to the parent container. There'll be times where you want to customize a card or the content within it, and it may not really adhere to that grid at all, like I mentioned just prior. It may be that the image is in the gutter or your text is wrapping to accommodate something else. And this is fine as long as the parent container, like this card, is on that grid within the columns, as you see here. This is an example of just like a card on a column, but you shouldn't really place it like this without anything beside it, because this brings me to my next point here. Now, your outside columns are not for padding. That's just not how it works. It may be that, the width of the content is just like either too wide or too small, and you're doing these dynamic layouts, and it does have its place, don't get me wrong, but it will have an outside margin. And when you scale down, like your layout's going to have that outside margin. And when you scale down, your margin can be adjusted to give you more space on each end. So if you're definitely use breakpoints if you need more padding. So an example is you can do these purposeful layouts where, things are staggered and there's like, 2-column spacing on either side or how many pixels you need. That's fine. But if you find that, okay, I need more padding on either side here and I want this to be centered, I think the goal here is to, make this a whole section and then center that content inward and keep it very consistent. Don't just like do it, as a one-off thing. You see how like this is kind of like all over the place. It doesn't really allow our eyes to kind of flow naturally through it. And that's just not how, it's going to naturally work in the real world. You're going to have the developer that you need to really work closely with to figure out, what sections are going to be like these components where I'm going to have like 40 pixel or 120 pixels spacing on the right here, and then it's going to stagger. It just gets things unnecessarily really complex. It just makes a really big mess of things. So I try to keep it very consistent and very easy for everyone that's going to be implementing my designs. You have to think about your developers too. Now, one of the last things I do want to bring up are full bleed elements. Now, you will design websites, you probably already have, and you will have like these massive hero pages where they're just going to bleed right off of your actual columns, and that's fine. Your full bleed elements can go beyond your grid and stretch to the edge. Your frame over here, artboard, frame, canvas, whatever you'd like to call this area, it's just a frame, but it can stretch right across to the edge. And that's about it. Nothing else is going to be able to stretch beyond that. You notice how this is still on that grid over here. It's kind of hard to see, but the navigation is still there. The text is still there. The button is just kind of like centered, and that's fine. But this container is like beyond that grid. So that's it. You're good to go off and actually use the grids that we designed. Go start using them to build some of our next designs and keep them handy, because that's what we're going to definitely use. And I would say try and create your own grid and keep going.